So we are going to continue our look at using the IMVU toolkit to make poses. So today we're going to take a look at making a seating or sitting pose. So as always, we need Blender open. We need to rejig the interface. So rejig to fit. Then create our duplicate, double click, TikTok outliner, and double click TikTok 3D. So join these together. So right click on the border, get that down there, outliner, right. So toolkit, view, sidebar, IMVU toolkit. We need the animation tool. Click on the button and drop in the animation avatar. Scrunch that down there. Get rid of that. So, sitting pose. So this is the rigged avatar as we've been looking at in previous streams. So we've got our rig, which are the shapes, and then the avatar, which is obviously the mesh. So all we're doing is using these control elements to deform the mesh or shape the mesh. So we need to make sure that we're in pose mode. At the moment we're in object mode, which is the orange outline. So object, pose mode, switch to pose mode, and as with the odd poses that we looked at last time, a sitting pose requires us to move the upper half of the avatar, and the way that we do that is we leave the shape that represents female O3 master root, we leave that where it is, so we don't touch this. Again, we move and manipulate the shape that represents the pelvis node or the pelvis bone. So we select that. Actually, before we do, shortcut key N to bring up the toolkit. We want to save us some time, auto key, enable that, and it'll drop in our keyframes into the timeline as we pose our elements. So auto key. We can leave the other things till later when we actually export this and get it into IMVU. So close that, N key. So for a sitting pose, we need to use our widgets. So move, rotate, and again we are selecting the pelvis control. And all we're doing is grabbing that and moving it into position. And obviously we've got to keep an eye on what the legs do. So we can select that. These are our knees. The one thing we want to sort out are the hands, so the R key to rotate. And again, as before with the odd pose video, if we move the pelvis, it's going to deform the legs. So we can see that it's collapsed the thighs. So what we want to try and do is compensate for that using rotate to try and rotate what is the pelvis bone and then compensate with the hip bones and the lower spine. So that's the hips, and we can use that to twist the hips forward to try and minimize the way that this section deforms because we've used the pelvis bone. So everything is linked. So G key to grab, G key to grab. Let's just do a standard palms resting on legs pose. Nothing too special or too difficult. Like so. And for the other one, grab that. So that's a G key again. And the one thing to keep in mind is that although the two avatars, the male and the female, use the same rig, the meshes are slightly different. So there may be some fiddling around with the pose to compensate for the way that the male skeleton, so for example in the elbows, so female elbows tend to not point, tend to deform inwards, whereas male elbows tend to deform outwards. So you need to keep that kind of thing in mind when you're making your pose. So again, although we're using the same rig and we are using the female mesh avatar, we need to keep in mind the ultimate, let's get that back there, the ultimate target of the pose, whether it's the male or female avatar, because the bone structure determines how the avatar actually sits. Same with the knees. We can use the feet to twist. So, standard pose. Change the hands. So this again is using the G key to move and the R key to rotate. And then if we want, we can do a little bit more. So we want to move the fingers, but we want to have more control over the direction that the fingers bend or rotate. Right now, it's set to global, which means it's being manipulated relative to the scene. So the movement is perpendicular to the scene. What we want is to have it rotate, move, or manipulate perpendicular to the element that's actually selected. So for that, we want to change our transform orientations. So this basically is the orientation of this thing, the widget. That's the direction in which the widget operates. At the moment, it's in global, which is relative to the scene. But what we want is either local or normal. Either or will do. And that switches the orientation of the widget to align to the chain of bones, which now means that we can manipulate. This is actually for the little finger. That's one thing you need to be aware of with the rig, is that although the bone chain is set up correctly relative to how the skeleton will deform, the placement of the skeleton relative to the mesh, or vice versa, the mesh to the skeleton, is that it's slightly offset. And this is what you actually want to be watching, is what the mesh does, not necessarily what the skeleton does. So the skeleton, the bones, that gives you your pose information in terms of the articulation of the individual control elements or bones of the avatar and how that's deforming the mesh. But in terms of the actual position, the physical position of the pose relative to whether it's the avatar itself or an object that it might be posed against, you want to keep an eye on what the mesh is doing. So for example, in this case, we want the hand to be, or the fingers, to just follow the side of the leg. So it's a relaxed pose. And this is where it can get a little bit confusing because of the offset. And thumb. Straighten that out. And the other one. And we can drop the hand down a little bit. And we also need to keep in mind as well what avatar or body shape the pose is being made for. If it's a custom body shape, there's probably going to be some tweaking back and forth to make sure that the pose fits the avatar. Shift. Same for the other hand. And note as well here that so that is actually the little finger. Those are the bones for the little finger, but the little finger mesh is here. So it's just the fingers that do that. But it can get a little confusing because it looks like you're selecting the skeleton or the bones for the wrong finger. Straighten those out. That's the wrong one. Hold Shift and this will allow you to move the selection slowly. That looks a little awkward, so there. Tweaking. And that is our basic sitting pose. So we don't move female O3 master root. This stays put because this is where the avatar is anchored in IMVU. So we don't move that. It has to stay put. Well, the actual bone control needs to stay put. The avatar, in theory, could actually move. The mesh itself, relative to that spot, could move, but it causes problems in IMVU in terms of matching your avatar up to or with whatever furniture item or other avatar might be in the scene. So this is the origin point. That's where the avatar appears and is anchored to the world in IMVU. So we want to keep that put, or don't touch that. It needs to be at 0, 0, grid center. Let's make this a little interesting. So let's do that's that. Rotate. So let's say the avatar might be sitting on a stool, slightly askew. Keep the foot level with the ground. And we can see that because of the way that the rig is set up, so when we move the foot, it moves the whole leg. But because of the way that the avatar, we have to adjust our hand positions because we've moved the legs. But because of the way that the bone chain is set up, it's actually deforming the entire leg. So if we watch the knee, when we move this, it moves the knee. So let's do so that might be the avatar sat on a stool, let's say. Ready to leave, or for example, let's put the hand switch back to global, make this alignment easier. So when we want to move the rig, the bones, the control elements relative to the avatar, as mentioned, we use local. But if we are now starting to pose the avatar relative to an object that might be in the scene, we want to use global. So we can switch back to global, which reorientates the widget. So now we can move the hand relative to an object that the avatar might be sitting on. So let's just imagine, and we can come back to this. Let's imagine that the avatar has their hand on the corner of a seat, So these two fingers are sitting on the edge of the seat, and these two fingers, the back two fingers, are drooping over the edge. Let's put a little, not that one, undo, spine. Maybe a little twist. Make the pose a little bit more interesting and dynamic, as the technical word would be. And then the head facing forward. So that could be, need to adjust the hand just a little bit. G key. Also, so here's a trick. So when we mentioned earlier that if you move the pelvis bone or the pelvis control, it's going to, there's no way about this, you can't avoid this, it's going to deform this upper section of the, and that's literally just because of the construction of the mesh. So you can alter, no, that's the hip bone. You can alter the hip control to rotate that to compensate, so that you roll it forward so that the thigh section of the mesh doesn't collapse as much as it should do. But what you can also do with your poses is hide or obscure these issues. As is the case here, we've used the hand to cover up or hide this awkward deformation of the mesh where it collapses in on itself because of the structure of the mesh. So we can use the pose, undo that, undo. We can use the way that the avatar is posed to hide things like that. Right, so that's our pose. So let's save this. File, save as. And we need to be in, whoops, let's put that on screen. It's going to be a bit too tight. So, no, not rooms. Avatar, there we go. TikTok, sitting. Save as. Right, so that's our pose. And with the toolkit, we've got auto key set. We did that before. We could do this at any point. It doesn't really matter, because whilst we're working on a pose, as long as we don't do anything to essentially upset what we've done, Blender will keep the position of the bones in place. And then what we could have done, had this not been enabled, if that was disabled, all we'd do is just select all and then pose, animation, insert keyframe, and then we would insert location and rotation only. IMVU doesn't use scale, so we can't use scale, so it's just location and rotation. So we would insert that, click on that, and it would insert the positional coordinates for all the selected elements. But as we had auto insert or auto key enabled, we don't need to do that. So save the file, save. So we'll do this backwards, because normally it's the other way around. Now that we've got a pose, let's drop out of pose mode into object mode. So that's our pose. And let's just make a quick reference furniture object. So we're just going to add mesh cube. Let's add mesh cube, drop in a cube, and we're going to edit this relative to what the avatar is doing. So hold control snaps the grid, so we get that at the bottom. Edit mode, face select, select. Let's just move that up. Let's just turn this into a simple stool. So let's go with loop cut, select S, loop select, Let's just go with a simple mushroom stool. So the avatar is sat on the end or the edge. We've got to move this in a way that so if that were the furniture item, that would be our reference object. So back into pose mode, because we have to adjust the pose. Because the seat, I mean, unless there was another object on here. Let's add one, actually. So you wouldn't normally do this way around. You'd do it the other way around. You'd have your furniture item made, and your furniture item would have a seat node, and we would be posing the avatar relative to where the seat node is, relative to the mesh. But we're doing it this way around because this is a series about making poses rather than furniture items. So let's just add another mesh. Let's say it's a book. So squash that down. Loop cut, so Control R for the tool. This is just a very simple book. Face select. Inset, that's the I key, or which one's inset? That's the inset tool. It's a little tricky to use. Then inset again, because what we'll then do is use fatten, shrink that inwards. We've got a little book. Move that into position. Like so. And there we can see, let's just squash that down a little bit. So select all. Duplicate. Let's just make a small stack of books. Make this smaller, scale. Oops. But be careful where you select or click drag when using the widgets. Got to make sure that the loop, the colored loop, highlights. Otherwise, you're manipulating the object in multiple axes. And it can be a little tricky to select it sometimes. So there's our furniture reference object with two. Get that back down there. So rather than editing the pose necessarily, we've made the furniture item fit it rather than the other way around. And normally you would do it that way around. You would make your furniture item first and then fit your pose to the furniture item. Because the problem with doing it this way around is that ideally we want, well, you can do it this way around, but ideally it complicates the process a little if we do it backwards like this. So if we create the pose first and then make our furniture item to fit the pose, it can get a little confusing if we need to add more poses, because we've now got to figure out relative to, as a furniture item, relative to where the actual furniture meshes are, we've got to now try and figure out the position of the seat node relative to our furniture item. And as we've fit the furniture item to the pose, it's offset from center. So when we convert something like this into a furniture item, we now have to try and match that so that the pose sits where it's supposed to. So this is, we might be able to do it with something like this because we've kind of locked it to the grid. So we are 2 this way and 1 that way. So if you're going to do that, try and fit it more or less to the grid, your reference object. But that doesn't look too bad actually. But that's just a quick reference object that we can use. But because we've done this, we could actually then bring these elements into the furniture tool and actually set these up correctly as a furniture item with seat nodes that accommodate custom seat poses, which is what this is, and then put everything together properly. And in this case, that might just mean offsetting the avatar slightly relative to the furniture item, or doing vice versa. This is why you want to do your furniture item first and then your poses, rather than the way that we've just done it. But that is a sitting pose with a reference object. Let's do the outliner. So where are our objects? This is the outliner view. There are our objects. So we can't export any of this just yet because let's just enable wireframe. So that we can see our objects. But that's our pose. So let's just save this. File is save as. So that's our pose. We're going to export this now. Because it's a pose, we want to enable make pose and export all bones. Make pose, export all bones. We don't need the morph controls because we haven't set a facial expression. So disable that, make sure that's selected, double check. We've got all our keyframes, which we have. Save increment. So that's number 2. And then all we need to do in the toolkit is export. So we don't use this, we don't use that. If we're using the toolkit, we use the toolkit's exporter. So select the armature, click export. This is the confirmation that we are looking for. So the toolkit jigs the timeline to create a sequence that's compatible with IMVU. If you don't do this, or if this isn't done, this won't be a compatible pose, so it won't work correctly in IMVU. So the confirmation is the toolkit modifying the timeline. Well, actually, one thing we want to do before we actually do anything is select our armature, change the name. We don't want to use this generic name because that might override something that's already named control_armature action. That's the default generic name that's attributed to the action. So let's call this TikTok_sitting. Save the file, save, and then just re-export. It'll save it quicker the next time. So we've got our FBX, so now we want to be in IMVU Studio. So this could get a little awkward because we can't shrink Studio down as much as we can with Blender. So we need to create a new project, and for this we just want to use the PID, and we're just going to derive from the empty mood derivable because it's an easy, quick way to test poses. So that's 10,945,930 PID. There it is. Select. So obviously it doesn't show anything in the preview, and then just click on derive. So that's the avatar based on our inventory, so the default female. And all we need to do now is import the FBX. FBX, import FBX, whoops, browse to, so we need to be in Avatar, Blender, and it will be appended or prepended pose. Where is it? Pose, couples, pose, control, see, that's the, we already had one called control armature action. Exporting the avatar using the default name would have overwritten this. There it is, TikTok sitting. Select, open. So we're going to go through the import process. It's already found our animation, so set up FBX. We don't need to change anything here. This is all okay because we're bringing in an animation. Next, no materials. There is our animation. Review, import. So it won't do anything because it doesn't auto-assemble action sequences, but there is the asset. So we need to be in component, action, new action. Then we need to edit this. So we need to name this, well, let's call it start.idle so that we can see it, because the idle plays regardless of the state of the avatar, whether it's sitting or standing. If we use the actual trigger, which might be sitting, the avatar would only animate in the seated, or if it was sitting on a seat.sitting seat node associated with the furniture or a furniture room. So idle just allows us to override that and play the sequence regardless of that trigger. So avatar, we need a new ensemble. There's the ensemble controls, and we should have in our asset, there it is, anim TikTok sitting. It's been converted from, well, not from an FBX, it's been converted from the data that's in the FBX to an XAF file for IMVU. So this is a static pose, so start frame 1, end frame 2, so we're only playing a single frame, and that's looped forever, 0. Everything else is okay. We can disable gaze, apply, preview, and there is our sitting or seated pose. Exactly as designed in Blender. So of course all we need to do now is just save this file, save as, sitting, so save, and then info, we can upload this. So choose our icon, which are a bit iffy for poses, so we only get, what about torso? Nope. So we've got these controls, not controls, we've got these options on the side that aren't brilliant when it comes to poses, because it only captures a certain aspect of the avatar. So what we might have to do with these is load in a default generic icon. Select. So that's our icon. That will be used for both classic and desktop mobile. Right, so TikTok sitting, general audience, accessories, female. So again, we can make this unisex, but as mentioned previously, we want to be aware of the fact that the male and female skeleton deforms slightly differently based on the pose itself. So for the male avatar, we might be able to pose the legs slightly differently and the elbows, so they would, generally speaking, stick out. Same with the knees. So if you wanted to be accurate, relatively speaking, you would do another pose or another version of this same pose and export that as specific to the male avatar. But in this case, we'll just make it female. But we do have the unisex option for using the same pose for both male and female avatars. So female, let's give this 100 credits. And that's it. So we've got our settings down at the bottom. Save, and then submit. So there's our submission fees. Submit. Okay, and that's the product submitted to the catalog. But that is creating a sitting pose using the toolkit for IMVU.